Good morning and welcome back to Reading Wikis for You, where we read the wiki articles for you. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Vought F4U Corsair, another American fighter plane from World War II. Now, as somebody who grew up watching Black Sheep Squadron, it was on reruns on the weekend, so didn't get to catch all the episodes, but watched a few. And remembering how fun it was when I caught another YouTube video with the habitual line crosser, it just brought back a flood of memories, and so I decided to add it into the list. So, hope you all enjoy it. As always, while I'm reading, drop a comment down below. Let me know what you'd like to see next, but otherwise, let's get into it. The Vought F4U Corsair is an American fighter aircraft that saw service primarily in World War II and the Korean War. Designed and initially manufactured by Chance Vought, the Corsair was soon in great demand. Additional production contracts were given to Goodyear, whose Corsairs were designated FG, and Brewster, designated F3A. The Corsair was designed and principally operated as a carrier-based aircraft and entered service in large numbers with the U.S. Navy and Marines in World War II. It quickly became one of the most capable carrier-based fighter bombers of the war. Some Japanese pilots regarded it as the most formidable American fighter, and U.S. naval aviators achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio. Early problems with carrier landings and logistics led to it being eclipsed as the dominant carrier-based fighter by the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, powered by the same double Wasp engine first flown on the Corsair's initial prototype in 1940. The Corsair's early development was to land-based squadrons of the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy. The Corsair served almost exclusively as a fighter bomber throughout the Korean War and during the French colonial wars in Indochina and Algeria. In addition to its use by the US and British, the Corsair was also used by the Royal New Zealand Air Force, French Naval Aviation, and other air forces until the 1960s. From the first prototype delivery to the US Navy in 1940 to final delivery in 1953 to the French, 12,571 F4U Corsairs were manufactured in 16 separate models. Its 1942 to 1953 production run was the longest of any U.S. piston-engined fighter. Development. In February 1938, the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics published two requests for proposal for twin-engined and single-engine fighters. For the single-engine fighter, the Navy requested the maximum obtainable speed and a minimum stalling speed not higher than 70 miles per hour. A range of 1,000 miles was specified. The fighter had to carry 4 guns, or 3 with increased ammunition. Provision had to be made for anti-aircraft bombs to be carried in the wings. These small bombs would, according to thinking in the 1930s, be dropped on enemy aircraft formations. In June 1938, the U.S. Navy signed a contract with Vought for a prototype bearing the factory designation V166B. The XF4U-1 BU-NO 1443. The Corsair design team was led by Rex Beazle. After mock-up inspection in February 1939, construction of the XF4U-1, powered by an XR 2800-4 prototype of the Pratt Whitney R2800 double Wasp twin-row 18-cylinder radial engine, rated at 1,805 horsepower, went ahead quickly as the first airframe ever designed from the start to have a double Wasp engine fitted for flight. When the prototype was completed, it had the biggest and most powerful engine, largest propeller, and probably the largest wing on any naval fighter to date. The first flight of the XF4U-1 was made on 29 May 1940, with Lyman A. Bullard Jr. at the controls. The maiden flight proceeded normally until a hurried landing was made when the elevator trim tabs failed because of flutter. On 1 October 1940, the XF4U-1 became the first single-engined U.S. fighter to fly faster than 400 miles per hour by flying at an average ground speed of 405 miles per hour from Stratford to Hartford. The USAAC's twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning had flown over 400 miles per hour in January to February 1939. The XF4U-1 also had an excellent rate of climb, although testing revealed some requirements would have to be rewritten. In full-power dive tests, speeds of up to 550 miles per hour were achieved, but not without damage to the control surfaces and access panels, and in one case, an engine failure. The spin recovery standards also had to be relaxed, as recovery from the required 2-turn spin proved impossible without resorting to an anti-spin chute. The problems clearly meant delays in getting the design into production. Reports coming back from the war in Europe indicated an armament of two 0.3 inch or 7.62 millimeter synchronized engine cowling mount machine guns and two 50 caliber or 0.5 inch 12.7 millimeter machine guns, one in each outer wing panel, was insufficient. The U.S. Navy's November 1940 production proposal specified heavier armament. The increased armament comprised three 50 caliber machine guns mounted in each wing panel. This improvement greatly increased the ability of the Corsair to shoot down enemy aircraft. Formal U.S. Navy acceptance trials for the XF4U-1 begin in February 1941. The Navy entered into a letter of intent on 3 March 1941, received Vought's production proposal on 2 April, and awarded Vought a contract for 584 F4U-1 fighters, which were given the name Corsair, inherited from the firm's late 1920s Vought O2U naval biplane Scout, which first bore the name, on 30 June of the same year. The first production F4U-1 performed its initial flight a year later on 24 June 1942. It was a remarkable achievement for Vought compared to land-based counterparts. Carrier aircraft are overbuilt and heavier to withstand the extreme stress of deck landings. Design. Engine considerations. The F4U incorporated the largest engine available at the time, the 2,000 horsepower 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial. To extract as much power as possible, a relatively large Hamilton Standard hydromatic 3-blade propeller of 13 feet 4 inches was used. Landing gear and wings. To accommodate a folding wing, the designers considered retracting the main landing gear rearward, but for the chord of wing that was chosen, making the landing gear struts long enough to provide ground clearance for the large propeller was difficult. Their solution was an inverted gull wing, which considerably shortened the required length of the struts. The anhedral of the wing's inboard section also permitted the wing and fuselage to meet at the optimum angle for minimizing drag without using wing root fairings. The bent wing was heavier and more difficult to construct, however, offsetting these benefits. The Corsair's aerodynamics were in advance over those of contemporary naval fighters. The F4U was the first U.S. Navy aircraft to feature landing gear that retracted into a fully enclosed wheel well. The landing gear oleo struts, each with its own strut door enclosing it when it retracted, rotated through 90 degrees during retraction, with the wheel atop the lower end of the strut when retracted. A pair of rectangular doors enclosed each wheel well, leaving a streamlined wing. This swiveling, aft retracting landing gear design was common to the Curtiss P-40 and its predecessor, the P-36. As adopted for the F4U Corsair's main gear and its Pacific War counterpart, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The oil coolers were mounted in the heavily anhedraled inboard section of the wings alongside the supercharger air intakes, and used openings in the leading edges of the wings rather than protruding scoops. The large fuselage panels were made of aluminum and were attached to the frames with the newly developed technique of spot welding, thus mostly eliminating the use of rivets. While employing this new technology, the Corsair was also the last American-produced fighter aircraft to feature fabric as the skinning for the top and bottom of each outer wing aft of the main spar and armament bays, and for the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. The elevators were also constructed from plywood. The Corsair, even with its streamlining and high-speed abilities, could fly slowly enough for character landings with full flap deployment of 50 degrees. Technical issues. In part because of its advances in technology and a top speed greater than existing Navy aircraft, numerous technical problems had to be solved before the Corsair entered service. Carrier suitability was a major development issue, prompting changes to the main landing gear, tail wheel, and tailhook. Early F4U-1s had difficulty recovering from developed spins, since the inverted gull wing's shape interfered with elevator authority. It was also found that the Corsair's left wing could stall and drop rapidly without warning during slow carrier landings. In addition, if the throttle were suddenly advanced, for example during an aborted landing, the left wing could stall and drop so quickly that the fighter could flip over with the rapid increase in power. These potentially lethal characteristics were later solved through the addition of a small 6-inch long stall strip to the leading edge of the outer right wing, just outboard of the gun ports. This allowed the right wing to stall at the same time as the left. Other problems were encountered during earlier carrier trials. Visibility problems caused by the Corsair's combination of an aft-mounted cockpit and long nose made landings hazardous for newly trained pilots. During landing approaches, it was found that oil from the opened hydraulically powered cowl flaps could spatter onto the windscreen, severely reducing visibility, and the undercarriage oleo struts had bad rebound characteristics on landing, allowing the aircraft to bounce down the carrier deck. The first problem was solved by locking the top cowl flaps in front of the windscreen down permanently, then replacing them with a fixed panel. The undercarriage bounce took more time to solve, but eventually a bleed valve incorporated in the legs allowed the hydraulic pressure to be released gradually as the aircraft landed. The Corsair was not considered fit for carrier use until the wing stall problems in the deck bounce could be solved. Meanwhile, the more docile and easier to build F6F Hellcat had begun entering service for its intended carrier-based role. The Navy aimed to standardize on a single type of carrier fighter, and although the Hellcat was slower than the Corsair, it was deemed simpler for inexperienced pilots to land on a carrier. The Hellcat proved to be successful almost immediately after its introduction. The Navy's decision to select the Hellcat allowed the Corsair to be assigned to the U.S. Marine Corps. With no initial requirement for carrier landings, the Marine Corps deployed the Corsair to devastating effect from land bases. Deployment of the Corsair aboard U.S. carriers was delayed until late 1944, by which time the last of the carrier landing issues related to the Corsair's long nose had been addressed by the British. Design modifications. Production F4U-1s featured several modifications from the XF4U-1, a change of armament to 6 wing-mounted 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each outer wing panel, and their ammunition, 400 rounds for the inner pair, 375 rounds for the outer, meant the location of the wing fuel tanks had to be changed. In order to keep the fuel tank close to the center of gravity, the only available position was in the forward fuselage ahead of the cockpit. Accordingly, as a 237 U.S. gallon self-sealing fuel tank replaced the fuselage-mounted armament, the cockpit had to be moved back by 32 inches and the fuselage lengthened. Later on, different variants of the F4U were given different armaments. While most Corsair variants had the standard armament of 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, some, like the F4U-1C, were equipped with 420mm M2 cannons for its main weapon. While these cannons were more powerful than the standard machine guns, they were not favored over the standard loadout. Only 200 units of this particular Corsair variant were produced, out of the total of 12,571. Other variants were capable of carrying mission-specific weapons such as rockets and bombs. The F4U was able to carry up to a total of 8 rockets, or 4 under each wing. It was able to carry up to 4,000 pounds of explosive ordnance. This helped the Corsair take on a fighter bomber role, giving it a more versatile role as a ground support aircraft as well as a fighter. In addition, 150 pounds of armor plate was installed, along with 1.5-inch bulletproof windscreen, which was set internally behind the curved plexiglass windscreen. The canopy could be jettisoned in an emergency, and half-elliptical plan-form transparent panels, much like those of certain variants of the Curtiss P-40, were inset into the sides of the fuselage's turtle deck structure behind the pilot's headrest, providing the pilot with a limited rear view over his shoulders. A rectangular plexiglass panel was inset into the lower center section to allow the pilot to see directly beneath the aircraft and assist with deck landings. The engine used was more powerful R2808 B series double wasp, which would produce 2,000 horsepower. On the wings, the flaps were changed to an NACA slotted type, and the ailerons were increased in span to increase the roll rate, with a consequent reduction in flap span. IFF transponder equipment was fitted in the rear fuselage. These changes increased the Corsair's weight by several hundred pounds. Performance. The performance of the Corsair was superior to most of its contemporaries. The F4U-1 was considerably faster than the Grumman F6F Hellcat, and only 13 miles per hour slower than the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. All three were powered by the R2800, but whereas the P-47 achieved its highest speed at 30,020 feet with the help of an intercooled turbocharger, the F4U-1 reached its maximum speed at 19,900 feet using a mechanically supercharged engine. Operational history. World War II, U.S. service, Navy testing and release to the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Navy received its first production F4U-1 on 31 July 1942, though getting it into service proved difficult. The framed birdcage-style canopy proved inadequate visibility for deck taxiing, and the long hose nose and nose-up attitude of the Corsair made it difficult to see straight ahead. The enormous torque of the double wasp engine also made it a handful for inexperienced pilots if they were forced to bolter. Early Navy pilots called the F4U the Hog, Hose Nose, or Bent Wing Widowmaker. Carrier qualification trials on the training carrier USS Wolverine and escort carriers USS Core and USS Charger in 1942 found that, despite visibility issues and control sensitivity, the Corsair was, quote, an excellent carrier type and very easy to land aboard. It is no different than any other airplane, unquote. Two Navy units, VF-12, October 1942, and later VF-17, April 1943, were equipped with the F4U. By April 1943, VF-12 had successfully completed deck landing qualification. At the time, the U.S. Navy also had the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which did not have the performance of the F-4U, but was a better deck landing aircraft. The Corsair was declared ready for combat at the end of 1942, though qualified to operate only from land bases until the last of the carrier qualification issues were worked out. VF-17 went aboard the USS Bunker Hill in late 1943, and the Chief of Naval Operations wanted to equip 4 air groups with Corsairs by the end of 1943. The Commander Air Forces Pacific had a different opinion, stating that, quote, in order to simplify spares problems and also to ensure flexibility in carrier operations, present practice in the Pacific is to assign all Corsairs to Marines and to equip flight RONs, or fighter squadrons, on medium and light carriers with Hellcats. VF-12 soon abandoned its aircraft to the Marines. VF-17 kept its Corsairs but was removed from its carrier, USS Bunker Hill, due to perceived difficulties in supplying parts at sea. The Marines needed a better fighter than the F-4F Wildcat. For them, it was not as important that the F-4U could be recovered aboard a carrier, as they usually flew from land bases. Growing pains aside, Marine Corps squadrons readily took the radical new fighter. Marine Corps combat. From February 1943 onward, the F-4U operated from Guadalcanal and ultimately other bases in the Solomon Islands. A dozen USMC F-4U-1s of VMF 124, commanded by Major William E. Guise, arrived at Henderson Field, codenamed Cactus, on 12 February. The first recorded combat engagement was on 14 February 1943, when Corsairs of VMF 124 under Major Guise assisted P-40s and P-38s in escorting a formation of consolidated B-24 Liberators on a raid against a Japanese aerodrome at Kahili. Japanese fighters contested the raid, and the Americans got the worst of it, with 4 P-38s, 2 P-40s, 2 Corsairs, and 2 Liberators lost. No more than 4 Japanese Zeros were destroyed. A Corsair was responsible for one of the kills, albeit due to a mid-air collision. The fiasco was referred to as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Despite the debut, the Marines quickly learned how to make better use of the aircraft and started demonstrating its superiority over Japanese fighters. By May, the Corsair units were getting the upper hand, and VMF 124 had produced the first Corsair ace, Second Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, who would rack up a total of 21 kills during the war. He remembered, quote, I learned quickly that altitude was paramount. Whoever had altitude dictated the terms of the battle, and there was nothing a Zero pilot could do to change that. We had him. The F-4U could outperform a Zero in every aspect except slow speed maneuverability and slow speed rate of climb. Therefore, you avoided getting slow when combating a Zero. It took time, but eventually we developed tactics and deployed them very effectively. There were times, however, that I tangled with a Zero at slow speed, one-on-one. In these instances, I considered myself fortunate to survive a battle. Of my 21 victories, 17 were against Zeros, and I lost 5 aircraft in combat. I was shot down 3 times, and I crashed one that plowed into the line back at base and wiped out another F-4U. VMF 113 was activated on 1 January 1943 at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro as part of Marine Base Defense Air Group 41. They were soon given their full complement of 24 F-4U Corsairs. On 26 March 1944, while escorting 4 B-25 bombers on a raid over Ponape, they recorded their first enemy kills, downing 8 Japanese aircraft. In April of that year, VMF 113 was tasked with providing air support for the landings at Ujlang. Since the assault was unopposed, the squadron quickly returned to striking Japanese targets in the Marshall Islands for the remainder of 1944. Corsairs were flown by the Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, led by Marine Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, in an area of the Solomon Islands called the Slot. Boyington was credited with 22 kills in F-4Us, of 28 total, including 6 in an AVG P-40, although his score with the AVG has been disputed. Other noted Corsair pilots of the period included VMF 124's Kenneth Walsh, James E. Sweat, Archie Donahue, and Bill Casey Case, VMF 215's Robert M. Hansen and Donald Aldrich, and VF 17's Tommy Blackburn, Roger Hedrick, and Ira Kepford. Night fighter versions equipped Navy and Marine units afloat and ashore. One particularly unusual kill was scored by Marine Lieutenant R.R. Klingman of VMF 312, the Checkerboards, over Okinawa. Klingman was in pursuit of a Japanese twin-engine aircraft at high altitude when his guns jammed due to the gun lubrication thickening from the extreme cold. He flew into and chopped off the enemy's tail with the large propeller of the Corsair. Despite smashing 5 inches off the end of his propeller blades, he managed to land safely after this aerial ramming attack. He was awarded the Navy Cross. At war's end, Corsairs were ashore on Okinawa, combating the kamikaze, and also were flying from fleet and escort carriers. VMF 312, 323, and 224, and some other Marine units met with success in the Battle of Okinawa. Field modifications for land-based Corsairs. Since Corsairs were being operated from shore bases while still awaiting approval for U.S. carrier operations, 965 FG-1As were built as land planes without their hydraulic wing folding mechanisms, hoping to improve performance by reducing aircraft weight, with the added benefit of minimizing complexity. These Corsair's wings could still be manually folded. A second option was to remove the folding mechanism in the field using a kit, which could be done for Vought and Brewster Corsairs as well. On 6 December 1943, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued guidance on weight reduction measures for the F4U-1, FG-1, and F-3A. Corsair squadrons operating from land bases were authorized to remove catapult hooks, arresting hooks, and associated equipment, which eliminated 48 pounds of unnecessary weight. While there is no data to indicate to what extent these modifications were incorporated, there are numerous photos in evidence of Corsairs of various manufacturers and models on islands in the Pacific without tail hooks installed. The RNZAF Corsairs were all land-based and all had the tail hooks removed. Fighter bomber. Corsairs also served well as fighter bombers in the Central Pacific and the Philippines. By early 1944, Marine pilots were beginning to exploit the type's considerable capabilities in the close support role in amphibious landings. Charles Lindbergh flew Corsairs with the Marines as a civilian technical advisor for United Aircraft Corporation in order to determine how best to increase the Corsair's payload and range in the attack role and to help evaluate future viability of single versus twin-engine fighter design for Vought. Lindbergh managed to get the F4U in the air with 4,000 pounds of bombs, with a 2,000-pound bomb on the center line and a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing. In the course of such experiments, he performed strikes on Japanese positions during the Battle for the Marshall Islands. By the beginning of 1945, the Corsair was a full-blown mud fighter, performing strikes with high-explosive bombs, napalm tanks, and HVARs. It proved versatile, able to operate everything from bat glide bombs to 11.75-inch Tiny Tim rockets. The aircraft was a prominent participant in the fighting for the Palau's, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Navy service. In November 1943, while operating as a shore-based unit in the Solomon Islands, VF-17 reinstalled the tailhooks so its F-4Us could land and refuel while providing top cover over the task force participating in the carrier raid on Rabaul. The squadron's pilots landed, refueled, and took off from their former home, Bunker Hill, and USS Essex on 11 November 1943. 12 USMC F-4U-1s arrived at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, on 12 February 1943. The U.S. Navy did not get into combat with the type until September 1943. The work done by the Royal Navy's FAA meant those models qualified for the type for U.S. carrier operations first. The U.S. Navy finally accepted the F-4U for shipboard operations in April 1944 after the longer oleo strut was fitted, which eliminated the tendency to bounce. The first U.S. Corsair unit to be based effectively on a carrier was the Pioneer USMC Squadron VMF-124, which joined Essex in December 1944. They were accompanied by VMF-213. The increasing need for fighter protection against kamikaze attacks resulted in more Corsair units being moved to carriers. Sortie, kill, and loss figures. U.S. figures compiled at the end of the war indicate that the F-4U and FG flew 64,051 operational sorties for the U.S. Marines and U.S. Navy through the conflict, or 44% of total fighter sorties, with only 9,581 sorties flown from carrier decks. F-4U and FG pilots claimed 2,140 air combat victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft for an overall kill ratio of over 11 to 1. While this gave the Corsair the lowest loss rate of any fighter in the Pacific War, this was due in part to operational circumstances. It primarily faced air-to-air combat in the Solomon Islands and Rabaul campaigns, as well as at Leyte and for kamikaze interception. But as operations shifted north and its mission shifted to ground attack, the aircraft saw less exposure to enemy aircraft, while other fighter types were exposed to more air combat. Against the best Japanese opponents, the aircraft claimed a 12 to 1 kill ratio against the Mitsubishi A6M0 and 6 to 1 against the Nakajima Ki-84, Kawanishi N1KJ, and Mitsubishi J2M combined during the last year of the war. The Corsair bore the brunt of U.S. fighter bomber missions, delivering 15,621 short tons, or 14,171 metric tons, of bombs during the war. 70% of total bombs dropped by U.S. fighters during the war. Corsair losses in World War II were as follows: aerial combat 189, enemy ground and shipboard anti-aircraft fire 349, operational losses during combat missions 230, operational losses during night non-combat flights 692, destroyed aboard ships or on the ground 164. Royal Navy. Enhancement for carrier suitability. In the early days of World War II, Royal Navy fighter requirements had been based on cumbersome two-seat designs, such as the fighter dive bomber Blackburn Skua and its turreted derivative, the Blackburn Rock, and the fighter reconnaissance fighter Fairey Fulmar, since it was expected that they would encounter only long-range bombers or flying boats, and that navigation over featureless seas required the assistance of a radio operator or navigator. The Royal Navy hurriedly adopted higher-performance single-seat aircraft such as the Hawker Sea Hurricane and the less robust Supermarine Seafire alongside, but neither aircraft had sufficient range to operate at a distance from a carrier's task force. The Corsair was welcomed as a more robust and versatile alternative. In November 1943, the Royal Navy received its first batch of 95 Vought F4U-1s, which were given the designation Corsair Mark I. The first squadrons were assembled and trained on the U.S. East Coast and then shipped across the Atlantic. The Royal Navy put the Corsair into carrier operations immediately. They found its landing characteristics dangerous, suffering a number of fatal crashes, but considered the Corsair to be the best option they had. In Royal Navy service, because of the limited hangar deck height in several British classes of British carrier, many Corsairs had their outer wings clipped by 8 inches to clear the deckhead. The change in span brought about the added benefit of improving the sink rate, reducing the F4U's propensity to float in the final stages of landing. The Royal Navy developed a number of modifications to the Corsair that made carrier landings more practical. Among these were a bulged canopy, similar to the Malcolm hood, raising the pilot's seat 7 inches, and wiring shut the cowl flaps across the top of the engine compartment, diverting oil and hydraulic fluid spray around the sides of the fuselage. The curved approach used with the Seafire was also adopted for landing Corsairs, ensuring the flight deck was kept in sight as long as possible. Deployment. The Royal Navy initially received 95 birdcage F4U-1s from Vought, which were designated Corsair Mark I in Fleet Air Arm Service. Next from Vought came 510 blown canopy F4U-1A or 1Ds, which were designated Corsair Mark II. The final 150 equivalent to the F4U-1D, but not separately designated in British use. 430 Brewster Corsairs, 334 F3A1, and 96 F3A1D, more than half of Brewster's total production, were delivered to Britain as the Corsair Mark III. 857 Goodyear Corsairs, 400 FG1 and 1A, and 457 FG1D were delivered and designated the Corsair Mark IV. The Mark IIs and Mark IVs were the only versions to be used in combat. The Royal Navy cleared the F4U for carrier operations well before the U.S. Navy and showed that the Corsair Mark II could be operated with reasonable success even from escort carriers. It was not without problems. One was excessive wear of the arrestor wires due to both the weight of the Corsair and the understandable tendency of the pilots to stay well above the stalling speed. A total of 2,012 Corsairs were supplied to the United Kingdom. Fleet Air Arm units were created and equipped in the United States at Quonset Point or Brunswick and then shipped to war theaters aboard escort carriers. The first FAA Corsair unit was 1830 NAS, created on the 1st of June 1943, and soon operating from HMS Illustrious. At the end of the war, 18 FAA squadrons were operating the Corsair. British Corsairs served both in Europe and in the Pacific. The first and also most important European operations were the series of attacks, Operation Tungsten, in April, July, and August 1944 on the German battleship Tirpitz, for which Corsairs from HMS Victorious and HMS Formidable provided fighter cover. It appears the Corsairs did not encounter aerial opposition on these raids. From April 1944, Corsairs from the British Pacific Fleet took part in several major air raids in Southeast Asia, beginning with Operation Cockpit, an attack on Japanese targets at Sabaing Island in the Dutch East Indies. In July and August 1945, Corsair Naval Squadrons 1834, 1836, 1841, and 1842 took part in a series of strikes on the Japanese mainland near Tokyo. These squadrons operated from Victorious and Formidable. On 9 August 1944, days before the end of the war, Corsairs from Formidable attacked Shiogama Harbor on the northeast coast of Japan. Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserve pilot Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray of 1841 Squadron was hit by flak but pressed home his attack on the Japanese destroyer escort Amakusa, sinking it with a 1,000-pound bomb but crashing into the sea. He was posthumously awarded Canada's last Victoria Cross, becoming the second fighter pilot of the war to earn a Victoria Cross, as well as the final Canadian casualty of World War II. FAA Corsairs originally fought in a camouflage scheme with dark slate gray, extra dark sea gray disruptive pattern on top and sky undersides, but were later painted overall dark blue, as it had become imperative for all Allied aircraft in the Pacific theater of World War II to abandon all use of any red devices in their national insignia to prevent any chance of misidentification with Japanese military aircraft, all of which bore the circular all-red Hinomaru insignia, nicknamed a meatball by Allied aircrew, that is still in use to this day. The United States removed all areas of red color, specifically removing the red center to the roundel, and removed any sort of national fin or rudder markings, which at that time had 7 horizontal red stripes, from the American National Aircraft Insignia Scheme by 6 May 1942. The British did likewise, starting with a simple paint over with white paint of their Type C roundel's red center, at about the time the U.S. Navy removed the red center from their roundel. Later, a shade of slate gray center color replaced the white color on the earlier roundel. When the Americans started using the added white bars to either side of their blue-white star roundel on 28 June 1943, SEAC British Corsairs, most of all of which still used the earlier blue-white Type C roundel with the red center removed, added similar white bars to either side of their blue-white roundels to emulate the Americans. In all, out of 18 carrier-based squadrons, 8 saw combat, flying intensive ground attack interdiction operations, and claiming 47.5 aircraft shot down. At the end of World War II, under the terms of the Lend-Lease Agreement, the aircraft had to be paid for or to be returned to the U.S. As the UK did not have any means to pay for them, the Royal Navy Corsairs were pushed overboard into the sea in Moreton Bay off Brisbane, Australia. Royal New Zealand Air Force. Equipped with obsolescent Curtiss P-40s, Royal New Zealand Air Force squadrons in the South Pacific performed impressively, and particularly in the air-to-air role. The American government accordingly decided to give New Zealand early access to the Corsair, especially as it was not initially being used from carriers. In addition, as the war moved up the island chain, the RNZAF moved from the U.S. Army Air Corps zone to the U.S. Navy zone, reporting into Chester Nimitz, and needed to use the U.S. Navy supply lines, making the P-40 unworkable. Some 424 Corsairs equipped 13 RNZAF squadrons, including No. 14 Squadron RNZAF and No. 15 Squadron, replacing Douglas SBD Dauntlesses as well as P-40s. Most of the F4U-1s were assembled by Unit 60, with a further batch assembled and flown at RNZAF Station Hobsonville. In total, there were 336 F4U-1s and 41 F4U-1Ds used by the RNZAF during the Second World War. 60 FG-1Ds arrived late in the war. The first deliveries of Lend-Lease Corsairs began in March 1944 with the arrival of 30 F4U-1s at the RNZAF Base Depot Workshops, or Unit 60, on the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. From April, these workshops became responsible for assembling all Corsairs for the RNZAF units operating the aircraft in the Southwest Pacific, and a test and dispatch flight was set up to test the aircraft after assembly. By June 1944, 100 Corsairs had been assembled and test flown. The first squadrons to use the Corsair were 20 and 21 squadrons on Espiritu Santo. Operational in May 1944, the organization of the RNZAF in the Pacific and New Zealand meant that only the pilots and a small staff belonged to each squadron. Squadrons were assigned to several servicing units, which carried out aircraft maintenance and operated from fixed locations. Hence, F4U-1 NZ5313 was first used by 20 Squadron 1SU on Guadalcanal in May 1944. 20 Squadron was then relocated to 2SU in Bougainville in November. In all, there were 10 frontline SUs, plus another 3 based in New Zealand. Because each of the SUs painted its aircraft with distinctive markings, and the aircraft themselves could be repainted in several different color schemes, the RNZAF Corsairs were far less uniform in appearance than their American and FAA contemporaries. By late 1944, the F4U had equipped all 10 Pacific-based fighter squadrons of the RNZAF. By the time the Corsairs arrived, there were very few Japanese aircraft left in New Zealand's allocated sectors of the southern Pacific, and despite the RNZAF squadrons extending their operations to more northern islands, they were primarily used for close support of American, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers fighting the Japanese. At the end of 1945, all Corsair squadrons but one, No. 14, were disbanded. That last squadron was based in Japan until the Corsair was retired from service in 1947. No. 14 Squadron was given new FG-1Ds and in March 1946 transferred to Iwakuni, Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force. Only one airworthy example of the 137 aircraft procured survives. FG-1D, owned by the Old Stick and Rudder Company at Masterson, New Zealand. Captured Corsairs. On 18 July 1944, a British Corsair of 1841 Naval Air Squadron was involved in anti-submarine patrol from HMS Formidable as it returned to Scapa Flow after the Operation Mascot attack on the German battleship Tirpitz. It flew in company with a ferry Barracuda. Due to technical problems, the Corsair made an emergency landing in a field in Hamarøy municipality north of Bodo, Norway. The pilot, Lieutenant Mathely, was taken prisoner and the aircraft was captured undamaged. Luftwaffe interrogators failed to get the pilot to explain how to fold the wings so as to transport the aircraft to Narvik. The Corsair was ferried by boat for further investigation. Later, the Corsair was taken to Germany and listed as one of the captured enemy aircraft, Beutflugzeug, based in Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Central German Military Aviation Test Facility and the equivalent of the Royal Aircraft Establishment for 1944 under repair. This was probably the only Corsair captured by the Germans. In 1945, U.S. forces captured an F4U Corsair near the Kasumigaura Flight School. The Japanese had repaired it by covering damaged parts on the wing with fabric and using spare parts from crashed F4Us. It seems Japan captured 2 force-landed Corsairs fairly late in the war and may have tested one in flight. Korean War. During the Korean War, the Corsair was used mostly in the close support role. The AU-1 Corsair was developed from the F4U-5 and was a ground attack version which normally operated at low altitudes. As a consequence, the Pratt & Whitney R2883W engine used a single-stage manually controlled supercharger rather than the 2-stage automatic supercharger of the 5. The versions of the Corsair used in Korea from 1950 to 1953 were the AU-1, F4U-4B, -4P, and -5N and -5NL. There were dogfights between F4Us and Soviet-built Yakovlev Yak-9 fighters early in the war, but when the enemy introduced the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-15, the Corsair was outmatched. On 10 September 1952, a MiG-15 made the mistake of getting into a turning contest with a Corsair piloted by Marine Captain Jesse G. Fulmar, with Fulmar shooting the MiG down with his 4 20mm cannons. In turn, 4 MiG-15s shot down Fulmar minutes later. Fulmar bailed out and was quickly rescued with little injury. F4U-5N and 5NL Corsair night fighters were used to attack enemy supply lines, including truck convoys and trains, as well as interdicting night attack aircraft such as the Polikarpov Po-2 Bedcheck Charlies, which were used to harass United Nations forces at night. The F4Us often operated with the help of C-47 flare ships, which dropped hundreds of 1 million candle power magnesium flares to illuminate the targets. For many operations detachments of U.S. Navy F4U-5Ns were posted to shore bases. The leader of one such unit, Lieutenant Guy Bordelon of VC-3 Det D off of USS Princeton, became the Navy's only ace in the war, in addition to being the only American ace in Korea that used a piston-engined aircraft. Bordelon, nicknamed Lucky Pierre, was credited with 3 Lavochkin LA-9s or LA-11s and 2 Yakovlev Yak-18s between 29 June and 16 and 17 July 1952. Navy and Marine Corsairs were credited with a total of 12 enemy aircraft. More generally, Corsairs performed attacks with cannons, napalm tanks, various iron bombs, and unguided rockets. The 5-inch HVAR was a reliable standby. Sturdy, Soviet-built armor proved resistant to the HVAR's punch, which led to new 6.5-inch shaped charge anti-tank warhead being developed. The result was called the Anti-Tank Aircraft Rocket, or ATAR. The 11-inch Tiny Tim was also used in combat with 2 under the belly. Lieutenant Thomas J. Hudner, Jr., flying an F4U-4 off of VF-32 off of USS Leyte, was awarded the Medal of Honor for crash landing his Corsair in an attempt to rescue his squadron mate, Ensign Jesse L. Brown, whose aircraft had been forced down by anti-aircraft fire near Chengjin. Brown, who did not survive the incident, was the U.S. Navy's first African-American naval aviator. Aeronavale. After the war, the French Navy had an urgent requirement for a powerful carrier-borne close air support aircraft to operate from the French Navy's 4 aircraft carriers that it acquired in the late 1940s. 2 former U.S. Navy and 2 Royal Navy carriers were transferred. Second-hand U.S. Navy Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers of Flotille 3F and 4F were used to attack enemy targets and support ground forces in the First Indochina War. Former U.S. Grumman F6F5 Hellcats and Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers were also used for close air support. A new and more capable aircraft was needed. First Indochina War. The last production Corsair was the F4U-7, which was built specifically for the French naval air arm, the Aéronavale. The XF4U-7 prototype did its test flight on 2 July 1952, with a total of 94 F4U-7s built for the French Navy's Aéronavale, 79 in 1952, 15 in 1953, with the last of the batch, the final Corsair built, rolled out on 31 January 1953. The F4U-7s were actually purchased by the U.S. Navy and passed on to the Aéronavale through the U.S. Military Assistance Program. The French Navy used its F4U-7s during the second half of the First Indochina War in the 1950s. 12F, 14F, and 15F flotillas, where they were supplemented by at least 25 ex-USMC AU-1s passed on to the French in 1954 after the end of the Korean War. On 15 January 1953, Flotille 14F, based at Karouba Air Base near Bizerte in Tunisia, became the first Aéronavale unit to receive the F4U-7 Corsair. Flotille F-14F pilots arrived at Da Nang, Vietnam on 17 April 1954, but without their aircraft. The next day, the carrier USS Saipan delivered 25 war-weary ground attack ex-USMC AU-1 Corsairs, flown by VMA-212 at the end of the Korean War, to Touraine Air Base. During 3 months operating over Vietnam, including in support of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Corsairs flew 959 combat sorties, totaling 1,335 flight hours. They dropped some 700 tons of bombs and fired more than 300 rockets and 70,000 20mm rounds. 6 aircraft were damaged and 2 shot down by Viet Minh. In September 1954, F4U-7 Corsairs were loaded aboard Dixmude and brought back to France in November. The surviving ex-USMC AU-1s were taken to the Philippines and returned to the U.S. Navy. In 1956, Flotille 15F returned to South Vietnam equipped with F4U-7 Corsairs. Suez Crisis. The 14F and 15F flotillas also took part in the Anglo-French-Israeli seizure of the Suez Canal. In October 1956, codenamed Operation Musketeer, the Corsairs were painted with yellow and black recognition stripes for this operation. They were tasked with destroying Egyptian Navy ships at Alexandria, but the presence of U.S. Navy ships prevented the successful completion of the mission. On 3 November, 16 F4U-7s attacked airfields in the Delta, with 1 Corsair shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 2 more Corsairs were damaged when landing back on the carriers. The Corsairs engaged in Operation Musketeer dropped a total of 25 tons of bombs and fired more than 500 rockets and 16,000 20mm rounds. Algerian War. As soon as they disembarked from the carriers that took part in Operation Musketeer at the end of 1956, all 3 Corsair flotillas moved to Telergma and Oran airfields in Algeria, from where they provided close air support and helicopter escort. They were joined by the new Flotille 17F, established at Hyeres in April 1958. French F4U-7 Corsairs, with some borrowed AU-1s of the 12F, 14F, 15F, and 17F flotillas, conducted missions during the Algerian War between 1955 and 1962. Between February and March 1958, several strikes and close air support missions were launched from Bois Belleau, the only carrier involved in the Algeria War. Tunisia. France recognized Tunisian independence and sovereignty in 1956, but continued to station military forces at Bizerte and planned to extend the airbase. In 1961, Tunisia asked France to evacuate the base. Tunisia imposed a blockade on the base on 17 July, hoping to force its evacuation. This resulted in a battle between militiamen and the French military, which lasted 3 days. French paratroopers, escorted by Corsairs of the 12F and 17F flotillas, were dropped to reinforce the base, and the Aéronavale launched airstrikes on Tunisian troops and vehicles between 19 and 21 July, carrying out more than 150 sorties. 3 Corsairs were damaged by ground fire. French experiments. In early 1959, Aéronavale experimented with the Vietnam War-era SS-11 wire-guided anti-tank missile on F4U-7 Corsairs. The 12F pilots trained for this experimental program were required to manually pilot the missile at approximately 2 kilometers from the target on low altitude with a joystick using the right hand while keeping track of its flare on its tail and piloting the aircraft using the left hand. An exercise that could be very tricky in a single-seat aircraft under combat conditions. Despite reportedly effective results during the test, this armament was not used with Corsairs during the ongoing Algerian War. The Aeronavale used 163 Corsairs, 94 F4U-7s, and 69 AU-1s. The last of them, used by the Quers-based F-14F flotilla, were out of service by September 1964, with some surviving for museum display or as civilian warbirds. By the early 1960s, two new modern aircraft carriers, Clemenceau and Foch, had entered service with the French Navy, and with them a new generation of jet-powered combat aircraft. Football War. Corsairs flew their final combat missions in 1969 during the Football War between Honduras and El Salvador, in service with both air forces. The conflict was allegedly triggered, though not really caused, by a disagreement over a soccer match. Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force shot down 3 Salvadoran Air Force aircraft on 17 July 1969. In the morning, he shot down a Cavalier Mustang, killing the pilot. In the afternoon, he shot down 2 FG-1s. The pilot of the second aircraft may have bailed out, but the third exploded in air, killing the pilot. These combats were the last among propeller-driven aircraft in the world, and also made Soto the only pilot credited with 3 kills in an American continental war. El Salvador did not shoot down any Honduran aircraft. At the outset of the Football War, El Salvador enlisted the assistance of several American pilots with P-51 and F-4U experience. Bob Love, a Korean war ace, Chuck Lyford, Ben Hall, and Lynn Garrison are believed to have flown combat missions, but it has never been confirmed. Lynn Garrison purchased F-4U-7 number 133693 from the French MAAG office when it was retired from French naval service in 1964. It was registered N693M and was later destroyed in a 1987 crash in San Diego, California. Legacy. The Corsair entered service in 1942. Although designed as a carrier fighter, initial operation from carrier decks proved to be troublesome. Its low-speed handling was tricky due to the left wing stalling before the right wing. This factor, together with poor visibility over the long nose, made landing a Corsair on a carrier a difficult task. For these reasons, most Corsairs initially went to Marine Corps squadrons which operated off land-based runways, with some early Goodyear-built examples being built with fixed wings. The USMC aviators welcomed the Corsair with open arms as its performance was far superior to the contemporary Brewster F-2A Buffalo and Grumman F-4F3 and 4 Wildcat. Moreover, the Corsair was able to outperform the primary Japanese fighter, the A6M0. While the Zero could outturn the F-4U at low speed, the Corsair was faster and could outclimb and outdive the A6M. This performance advantage, combined with the ability to take severe punishment, meant the pilot could place an enemy aircraft in the killing zone of the F-4U's 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns and keep him there long enough to inflict major damage. The 2,300 rounds carried by the Corsair gave just under 30 seconds of fire from each gun. Beginning in 1943, the Fleet Air Arm also received Corsairs and flew them successfully from Royal Navy carriers in combat with the British Pacific Fleet and in Norway. These were clipped-wing Corsairs. The wingtips shortened 8 inches to clear the lower overhead height of Royal Navy carriers. FAA also developed a curving landing approach to overcome the F-4U's deficiencies. Infantrymen nicknamed the Corsair the Sweetheart of the Marianas and the Angel of Okinawa for its roles in these campaigns. Among Navy and Marine aviators, the aircraft was nicknamed Ensign Eliminator and Bent Wing Eliminator because it required many more hours of flight training to master than any other Navy carrier-borne aircraft. It was also simply called U-Bird or Bent Wing Bird. Although Allied World War II sources frequently make the claim that the Japanese called the Corsair the Whistling Death, Japanese sources do not support this, and it was mainly known as the Sikorsky. The Corsair has been named the official aircraft of Connecticut due to its multiple connections to Connecticut businesses, including airframe manufacturer Vought Sikorsky Aircraft, engine manufacturer Pratt & Whitney, and propeller manufacturer Hamilton Standard. Variants. During World War II, Corsair production expanded beyond Vought to include Brewster and Goodyear models. Allied forces flying the aircraft in World War II included the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Eventually, more than 12,500 F-4Us were built, comprising 16 separate variants. All right, manufactured by Vought in 1940, the 1XF4U1, so the prototype. In 1942, the F4U1, the F4U1A, and the F4U1C. 758 F4U1s, 2,066 1As, 201 Cs. In 1944, They produced 1,675 1Ds and 5 XF4U-4s and 2,351 F4U-4s. In 1946, they produced 568 F4U-5s. In 1952, 111 AU-1s and 94 F4U-7s. Brewster produced in 1943 305 F3A1s, and in 1944 430 F3A1Ds. In 1943, Goodyear produced 1,704 FG1s. In 1944, they produced 2,303 FG1Ds. And at some unknown date, they also produced 5 F2G1s and 10 F2G2s for a total of 12,586 aircraft. All right, the F4U-1, the first production version of the Corsair with the distinctive birdcage canopy and low seating position. The difference between the XF4U-1 were as follows. 650 caliber Browning AN M2 machine guns were fitted in the outer wing panels, displacing fuel tanks. An enlarged 237 US gallon fuel tank was fitted ahead of the cockpit in place of the fuselage armament. The cockpit was moved back by 32 inches. The fuselage was lengthened by 1 foot 5 inches. The more powerful R2808 double wasp was fitted. 150 pounds of armor plate was fitted to the cockpit, and a 1.5 inch thick bullet resistant glass panel was fitted behind the curved windscreen. IFF transponder equipment was fitted. Curved transparent panels were incorporated into the fuselage behind the pilot's headrest. The flaps were changed from the deflector type to the NACA slotted. The span of the ailerons was increased while that of the flaps was decreased. 162 US gallon auxiliary fuel cell was installed in each wing leading edge just outboard of the guns. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm received 95 Vought F4U-1s. These were all early birdcage Corsairs. Vought also built a single F4U-1 two-seat trainer. The Navy showed no interest. F4U-1A, called Corsair Mark II by the Fleet Air Arm. Mid to late production Corsairs incorporated a new, taller, wider canopy with only 2 frames, very close to the Malcolm hood fitted on some British fighter aircraft, along with a simplified windscreen. The new canopy design allowed the semi-elliptical turtle deck flank windows to be omitted. The designation F4U-1A to differentiate these Corsairs from earlier birdcage variants was allowed to be used internally by manufacturers. The pilot seat was raised 7 inches, which combined with the new canopy and a 6-inch lengthening of the tail wheel strut allowed the pilot better visibility over the long nose. In addition to these changes, the bombing window under the cockpit was omitted. These Corsairs introduced a 6-inch long stall strip just outboard of the gun ports on the right wing leading edge and improved undercarriage oleo struts, which eliminated bouncing on landing, making these the first truly carrier-capable F4Us. 360 F4U-1As were delivered to the Fleet Air Arm. In British service, they were modified with clipped wings for use on British aircraft carriers, although the Royal Navy had been successfully operating the Corsair Mark I since 1 June 1943, when 1830 Naval Air Squadron was commissioned and assigned to HMS Illustrious. F4U-1s in many USMC squadrons had their arrestor hook removed. Additionally, an experimental R2808W engine with water injection was fitted on one of the late F4U-1As. After satisfactory results, many F4U-1As were fitted with the new power plant. The aircraft carried 237 US gallons in the main fuel tank located in the front of the cockpit, as well as an unarmored non-self-sealing 62 US gallon fuel tank in each wing. This version of the Corsair was the first to be able to carry a drop tank under the center section. With drop tanks fitted, the fighter had a maximum ferry range of just over 1,500 miles. F3A1 and F3A1D. This was the designation for the Brewster-built F4U-1. Labor troubles delayed production. The Navy terminated the company's contract, and Brewster folded soon after. Poor quality wing fittings meant that these aircraft were redlined for speed and prohibited from aerobatics after several lost their wings. None of the Brewster-built Corsairs reached frontline units. 430 Brewster Corsairs, more than half of Brewster's total production, were delivered to the Fleet Air Arm. FG-1A and FG-1D. This was the designation for Corsairs that were licensed built by Goodyear to the same specifications as Vought's Corsairs. The first Goodyear-built FG-1 flew in February 1943, and Goodyear began delivery of FG-1 Corsairs in April 1943. The company continued production until the end of the war and delivered 4,007 FG-1 series Corsairs, including 60 FG-1Ds to the RNZAF and 857 FG-1, FG-1A, and FG-1Ds to the Royal Navy as Corsair Mark IVs. F4U-1B. This was an unofficial post-war designation used to identify F4U-1s modified for fleet air arm use. F4U-1C. The prototype F4U-1C appeared in August 1943 and was based on an F4U-1. A total of 200 of this variant were built from July to November 1944. All were based on the F4U-1D and were built in parallel with that variant. Intended for ground attack as well as fighter missions, the F4U-1C was similar to the F4U-1D, but its 6 machine guns were replaced by 4 20mm AN-M2 cannons with 231 rounds of ammunition per gun. The F4U-1C was introduced to combat during 1945, most notably in the Okinawa campaign. The firepower of the 20mm was highly appreciated. It was believed that the 20mm cannon was more effective for all types of combat work than the 50 caliber machine gun. However, despite the superior firepower, many naval pilots preferred the 50 caliber machine guns in air combat due to jam and freezing problems with the 20mm cannons. These problems were reduced as the ordnance crews gained experience until the performance of the guns compared favorably with the 50 caliber, but freezing problems remained at 25 to 30,000 feet until gun heaters were installed. F4U-1D. This variant was introduced in April 1944 and was built in parallel with the F4U-1C. It had the new R2800 8W double WASP engine equipped with water injection. This change gave the aircraft up to 250 horsepower more power, which in turn increased performance. Speed was increased from 417 to 425 miles per hour. Due to the U.S. Navy's need for fighter bombers, it had a payload of rockets carried on permanent launching rails, as well as twin pylons for bombs or drop tanks. These modifications caused extra drag, but the additional fuel carried by 2 drop tanks would still allow the aircraft to fly relatively long missions despite heavy, unaerodynamic loads. A single-piece blown clear view canopy was adopted as standard equipment for the 1D model, and all later F4U production aircraft. 150 F4U-1Ds were delivered to the Fleet Air Arm. F4U-1P, a rare photo reconnaissance variant. XF4U-2, special night fighter variant equipped with 2 auxiliary fuel tanks. F4U-2, experimental conversion of the F4U-1 Corsair into a carrier-borne night fighter armed with 5 50 caliber machine guns. The outboard right gun was deleted and fitted with airborne intercept radar set in a radome placed outboard on the starboard wing. Since Vought was preoccupied with more important projects, only 32 were converted from existing F4U-1s by the Naval Aircraft Factory and another 2 by frontline units. The type saw combat with the VFN-101 aboard USS Enterprise and USS Intrepid in early 1944, VFN-75 in the Solomon Islands, and VMFN-532 on Tarawa. XF4U-3, experimental aircraft built to hold different engines in order to test the Corsair's performance with a variety of power plants. This variant never entered service. Goodyear also contributed a number of airframes designated FG-3 to the project. A single sub-variant, XF4U-3B, with minor modifications was also produced for the FAA. XF4U-4, new engine and cowling. F4U-4, the last variant to see action during World War II. Deliveries to the U.S. Navy of the F4U-4 began in early 1945. It had a 2,100 horsepower dual-stage supercharged 18W engine. When the cylinders were injected with the water-alcohol mixture, power was boosted to 2,450 horsepower. The aircraft required an air scoop under the nose, and the unarmored wing fuel tanks of 62 U.S. gallon capacities were removed for better maneuverability at the expense of maximum range. The propeller was changed to a 4-blade type. Maximum speed was increased to 448 miles per hour, and climb rate to over 4,500 feet per minute as opposed to the 2,900 feet per minute of the F4U-1A. The 4-Hog retained the original armament as had all the external load capabilities of the F4U-1D. Vought also tested the 2 F4U-4Xs with fixed wingtip tanks and an Aero Products 6-blade contraprop. 4 F4U-4B, 300 F4U-4s ordered with alternate gun armament of 420mm cannon. F4U-4E and F4U-4N developed late in World War II. These night fighters featured radar radomes projecting from the right wingtip. The 4E was fitted with the APS-4 search radar, while the 4N was fitted with the APS-6 type. In addition, these aircraft were often refitted with 4 20mm M2 cannons, similar to the F4U-1C. Though these variants would not see combat during World War II, the night fighter variants would see great use during the Korean War. F4U-4K, experimental radio-controlled target drone variant. F4U-4P, F4U-4 equivalent to the 1P, a rare photo reconnaissance variant. XF4U-5, new engine cowling, other extensive changes. F4U-5, a 1945 design modification of the F4U, first flown on 21 December 1945, was intended to increase the F4U-4 Corsair's overall performance and incorporate many Corsair pilot suggestions. Featured a more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2832E engine with a two-stage supercharger rated at a maximum of 2,760 horsepower. Other improvements included automatic blower controls, cowl flaps, intercooler doors, and oil cooler for the engine, spring tabs for the elevators and rudder, a completely modernized cockpit, a completely retractable tail wheel, and heated cannon bays and pilot head and pitot head. The cowling was lowered 2 degrees to help with forward visibility, but perhaps most striking is the first variant to feature all-metal wings. Maximum speed was 408 knots or 470 miles per hour, and max climb rate of at sea level 4,850 feet per minute. F4U-5N, radar-equipped version. 5NL, winterized version, fitted with rubber de-icing boots on the leading edge of the wings and tail. 5P, long-range photo reconnaissance version. Dash 6, redesignated AU-1. This was a ground attack version produced for the U.S. Marine Corps. Dash 7, AU-1 airframe with 43W engine developed for the French Navy. FG-1E, Goodyear FG-1 with radar equipment. FG-1K, Goodyear FG-1 as drone. FG-3, turbo supercharger version converted from FG-1D. FG-4, Goodyear F4U-4 never delivered. AU-1, U.S. Marines attack variant with extra armor to protect the pilot and fuel tank, and the oil coolers relocated inboard to reduce vulnerability to ground fire. The supercharger was simplified as the design was intended for low-altitude operation. Extra racks were also fitted. Fully loaded for combat, the AU-1 weighed 20% more than a fully loaded F4U-4 and was capable of carrying 8,200 pounds of bombs. The AU-1 had a maximum speed of 238 miles per hour at 9,500 feet when loaded with 4,600 pounds of bombs and a 150 US gallon drop tank. When loaded with 10 HVAR rockets and two 150-gallon drop tanks, maximum speed was 298 miles per hour at 19,700 feet. When not carrying external loads, maximum speed was 389 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. First produced in 1952 and used in Korea and retired in 1957, redesignated from F4U-6. Super Corsair variants. In March 1944, Pratt & Whitney requested an F4U Corsair from Vought Aircraft for evaluation of their new P&W R4360 Wasp Major 4-row 28-cylinder corncob radial engine. The F2G1 and F2G2 were significantly different aircraft. F2G1 featured a manual folding wing and 14-foot propeller, while the F2G2 had hydraulic-operated folding wings, 13-foot propeller, and carrier resting hook for carrier use. There were 5 pre-production XF2G1s. There were 10 production F2Gs. 5 F2Gs were sold as surplus and went on to racing success after the war, winning the Thompson Trophy races in 1947 and 49. The only surviving F2G1s are numbers 88454 and 88458. The only surviving F2G2 was number 88463. It was destroyed in a crash in September 2012 after having a full restoration completed in July 2011. Operators. Argentina. Argentine Navy Naval Aviation operated 26 F4U-5, 5N, 5NL Corsairs from 1956 to 1968 from ARA Independencia, 2nd Attack Squadron. El Salvador. Salvadoran Air Force operated 5 F4Us and 20 FG-1Ds from 1957 to 1976, Fighting and Bombing Squadron. France. French Navy Aeronavale operated 69 AU-1 and 94 F4U-7s from 1954 to 1964. Flotille F-12F, 14F, 15F, 17F, and Escadrille 10S and 57Fs. Honduras. Honduran Air Force operated 9 F4U-4s and 10 F4U-5Ns, 5NLs, 5Ps from 1956 to 1979. New Zealand. Royal New Zealand Air Force operated 368 F4U-1s and 60 FG-1Ds from 1944 to 1949. number 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26 squadrons of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. United Kingdom. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm operated 2012 Corsairs of all types during World War II, including 95 Corsair 1s, 510 Corsair 2s, 430 Corsair 3s, and 977 Corsair 4s. I'm not going to read all of these naval air squadrons from the Royal Air Force. There will be a link to the article in the description where you can see all of those if you're looking for one in particular. Also, the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. All right, surviving aircraft. According to the FAA, there are 45 privately owned F4Us in the United States. Specifications. Data from the F4U4 detail specification. The F4U4 airplane characteristics and performance. General characteristics. Crew, 1. Length, 33 feet 8 inches. Wingspan, 41 feet 0 inches. Height, 14 feet 9 inches. Wing area, 314 square feet. Empty weight, 9,205 pounds. Gross weight, 14,670 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight, 14,533 pounds. Power plant, 1 Pratt & Whitney R2800 18W radial engine with 2,380 horsepower. Propellers, 4-bladed. Performance, maximum speed, 446 miles per hour. Cruise speed, 215 miles per hour. Stall speed, 89 miles per hour. Range, 1,005 miles. Combat range, 328 miles. Service ceiling, 41,500 feet. Rate of climb, 4,360 feet per minute. Armament. Guns, 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 375 to 400 rounds per gun. Rockets, 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets and or 4,000 pounds of bombs. All right, notable appearances in media. That is the F4U Corsair in fiction. Unfortunately, I am not going to be able to read that because that is a separate article. But again, there will be a link down in the description. And then we've also got related aircraft of comparable role, configuration, and some related list. So there we go. There is the F4U Corsair. Just a gorgeous looking plane. And, I mean, come on. It got its own TV show. So let me know what you thought. Drop a comment down below. What do you think of the F4U? Does it get overshadowed by things like the P-38 or the P-51? Love to get your opinion on that. But as always, I'd love to get your comments on what articles you'd like to see next. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.